Welcome to week 13. This is lecture 13. Our topics today will be schooling, culture, and society. We'll basically be focusing on schooling across the life cycle, how culture can influence the life cycle. So there'll be two distinct parts to the lecture. You'll notice that some of this is repetition. We've kind of covered some of these issues before in previous lectures. However, I think what's good about this lecture is it kind of highlights schooling in particular and somewhat culture and their influence across the life cycle. You also notice that this is really just a basic overview of some of these topics. A person could actually really focus on these topics a great deal. You could actually study some of this stuff for a whole semester. Just keep that in mind, that this is just a basic overview. So let's get started. About preschool years. At one time, the idea of children going to school so early in life, especially as toddlers or preschoolers before the age of 5 or 6 or 7, was kind of unheard of because at one time, 50, 60 years ago, the vast majority of women lived at home, stayed at home, I should say. Of course they lived at home, but they stayed at home. They did not work. But as we've talked about previously this semester, more and more women have entered into the workforce. We also have single-parent families. And so preschool kids, preschoolers have entered into what are called child care centers, basically places where children before the age of entering school will go and stay during part or most of the day. And so the preschool period is really a new area, a relatively new area from a historical perspective. The important thing to remember here is that more and more children across the last 20 to 30 years, more and more children, preschool-age children, have entered into some formal child care facility or program of some sort. 3/4 of U.S. children are enrolled in some care outside of the home. Now, sometimes this care outside of the home is more informal. This could be with a relative, a grandparent typically. Could be a neighborhood program where a group of families have come together, have hired somebody to take care of their children during the day, to a more formal kind of child care or preschool care program, which most people are probably familiar with. There's increasing evidence that children benefit from this involvement in educational activity before they enter into some kind of formal schooling. At one time, it was felt 30 years ago, the people were saying this was deleterious for children. Children should not be cared for outside of their principal dwelling, home. Women should stay at home, should not go out into the workforce. But in fact, research shows that children can benefit from, first of all, that there's not necessarily a deleterious effect for children being cared for outside of the home at these early ages, and that secondly, there can be a beneficial effect for the child. Again, I've already talked about this. There are child care centers, family child care centers, informal care for kids. There are preschools, programs such as the Montessori preschools, which create an environment that fosters sensory, motor, and language development. So there are all sorts of different kinds of programs that are available for young children. There are also school child care programs, which means that some of the formal school settings have created preschool programs right within their own buildings. The effectiveness of child care centers is demonstrated in studies that show that developmental matches or basically children who go into preschool programs do as well and sometimes better than children who stay at home. That's where the literature is really shows us. Children, particularly children from impoverished homes, may benefit more than other peers, especially in terms of intellectual development. Now, there are both positive and negative influences of childcare on social development. That's true. Research has shown that, especially for those in care for more than 10 hours a week. So the benefits as well as any negative impact of these kinds of programs tends to become more evident for a particular child if that child is in care for more than 10 hours a week. Financial analysis shows that there's a greater than investment return in outcomes for children who attend preschool programs. What that means is there are higher graduation rates for children in these kinds of programs. They have greater earnings later in life. The children do themselves. There is lower involvement in crime or criminal activity, and fewer of these children enter into welfare programs when they themselves are adults and or have children. How do we know, though, what is a good quality care programs? These are not all created equal, obviously. Research shows that these are the typical features for high quality care programs for preschoolers. Well-trained providers, appropriate size and ratio for adults to children. No more than 1 adult to 5 children for 3-year-olds, and a maximum of 7 to 10 children per adult for 4 to 5-year-olds. Curricula are carefully planned and coordinated, so there is a clear curricula for the kids. There's a rich language environment, so there's a lot of interactivity with the adults. There's a lot of activities that encourage intellectual and language development. Caregivers show a sensitivity to the specific emotional needs or social needs of each child. The materials are age appropriate, of course. And then, of course, there's basic health and safety standards are followed for kids. Now, there's a very specific program called Head Start. And this is probably one of the best-known U.S. programs that is designed to promote future academic success for children who are enrolled in it. Head Start is specifically designed to serve what they call the whole child. That is, it addresses physical health, self-confidence, responsibility, social and emotional development, as well as language and academic development. Although graduates of Head Start tend to show immediate IQ gains, these gains do not last across time. So initially it was like, oh, it improves IQ, but that's not quite the case. There's an initial boost, and then that kind of levels off. Nonetheless, children who attend Head Start are more ready for future schooling than those who do not attend a Head Start program. There is a lot of longitudinal data that has followed children who were part of Head Start and then looked at them across time. Graduates of Head Start in general do better in their future school adjustment than their peers, I should say. They are less likely to need special education programs. They are able to retain their grade level. More recent research suggests that potential benefits of early intervention can be substantial, such as what I just reported: lower crime rates, lower involvement with the law, higher graduation rates. There's even some evidence to suggest that more children who go to Head Start go on to college. And not only do they go on to college, but they tend to graduate and finish college. So there are substantial short-term and long-term benefits. As far as the college piece, that is fairly new data, and I think we'll need to look at further data, further studies, I should say, to see, in fact, that is truly the case. Cross-culturally, in most developed countries, in most countries that have a high level of industrialization and technological advances, U.S. is really somewhat different because in the U.S. we don't have a coordinated national policy on preschool education. We do have Head Start, but that's a fairly limited program. Sometimes it's depending on what administration or what the Congress is doing, sometimes the program expands and sometimes that program contracts. So unlike countries such as France, Belgium, Sweden, Russia, Finland, we in the U.S. do not have a coordinated national policy on preschool education or on care for children in general. These kinds of decisions or programs are typically left at either the state or the local or county level, I should say. And much of what preschoolers, kinds of programs that preschoolers are enrolled into, typically are privately run. So we don't really have a tradition of teaching preschool-aged children. On the other hand, if you look at, for example, Japan, parents view preschool as a way of giving their children an opportunity to become members of a group as well as to prepare them for a more formal level of education. So there's a greater tradition in a country such as Japan. China, parents there see preschool primarily as a way of giving their children a good start academically. So there is a strong tradition or a stronger tradition within a country such as China. And like I said earlier, countries across the world, including especially either in Asia or in Europe, we see more of a tradition or more of a national policy. In America, really, children start formal education with kindergarten. That's the vast majority of our kids will start some kind of formal education with kindergarten. What makes a child ready for school? We've already talked about one thing. Preschool programs. Preschool programs help children to be prepared for a more formal level of education. But for kids who do not go into some kind of preschool program before they go into a formal program such as first or second grade, for example, research indicates that delaying children's entry into school does not necessarily provide an advantage to those children. So there was this idea that, oh, I'm going to delay a child going into school, they're not quite ready for going into school, let's delay them by a year and then we'll have them go into school then. There's no evidence to show that that actually helps those kids who are delayed. Some research points to some negative effects on the emotionality and appropriate behavior for kids who are held back. Age per se is not the critical indicator of school entry. Developmental signs of readiness are really a product of complex combination of factors, just like everything else when we talk about human behavior and human development. There's lots of factors that are involved. Several practical steps that caretakers can take to prepare their kids for school is creating an atmosphere that promotes what we would call school readiness. So there's promotion of literacy in the environment, of working with words, learning words, that kind of thing, talking to children regularly. Remember earlier in the semester we talked about baby talk, that can be very useful. But as children get older, moving away from baby talk and to more formal language development and formal talk, let's say, or typical talk, that helps children to prepare. Providing a place for children to do work, to be engaged in learning materials, not only before they go into school, but after they go into school is helpful. Helping children to problem solve just in daily activities, that also is helpful. And let's go back to the original idea, and that is preschool programs help children to prepare for formal education. Now, in the United States, we're seeing a phenomenon really in the last 10 to 15 years of more and more families choosing to homeschool their children. And there's lots of different reasons for that. Some parents do this because the children do have special needs. The parents do not feel that the children, or I should say the formal educational system will provide for their kids adequately, or that it could be very disruptive for the child. And so the parents or the family choose to homeschool these kids with special needs. Another large group of homeschoolers are people who do it for religious reasons. They don't feel that the formal educational setting would support their religious belief systems, and so they keep their children out of a formal education schooling environment and homeschool their kids for that reason. And then there's lots of other personal reasons that people choose to do that. Close to 1 million kids are homeschooled now. And this is a major educational phenomenon, and again, a more recent historical phenomenon in the United States. There's been some research about homeschooling. Homeschooled children do as well on standardized tests as their peers in schooling, so this doesn't tend to be a problem. One of the things to realize is that some of the critics of homeschooling have said, well, if the home life is very disrupted, if it's very dysfunctional, then children will tend not to learn in those environments. But the research shows that parents who do homeschool typically have homes that are very functional, very organized, and families have to be very organized in order to provide some kind of homeschooling. Nonetheless, there are critics of homeschooling and of this homeschooling tradition. Some critics feel that homeschooling limits the peer interactions that children can have. There's lack of exposure to diversity, not only to diverse people, to different types of people from different walks of life, but also to different types of learning experiences and learning environments. There may be a lack of technology or equipment that is in the home environment as opposed to the school environment. And some critics believe that many parents are not prepared to be teachers. So these are kind of some of the criticisms about homeschooling. Research really needs to look at this further. The research has only just begun to look at kids who are homeschooled compared to kids who are in formal education. So let's move on to older children. Let's talk about kids who are now enrolled into some kind of schooling program or learning program. Now preschoolers, but school-age kids now, and we're talking about kids roughly around the ages of 5 to 7 up through about 11 years of age. One of the biggest transitions for children in the learning or school environment is not so much from preschool to schooling. Again, remember, preschool tends to prepare children, younger children, for entering into a learning environment, a more formal learning environment. The bigger transition tends to be from elementary school to middle school. Middle school is really kind of a halfway place where children's educational environments begin to change, adapt, and adjust in preparation for high school as well as college. These transitions can be particularly stressful due to the number of changes that occur from elementary school to middle school. So for example, in middle school, children now start to move from one classroom environment to another, and from one teacher to another. Now there can be different teachers in preschool as well as in elementary school, but the physical moving from one classroom to another can be an adjustment for some children. There can also not only be different teachers, but different students in a classroom. So unlike, let's say, in elementary school where kids might be in the same classroom together, their peers stay together in the same schools, I should say in the same classes. In middle school, children now start to have more individualized educational programs. So there can also be a shift in hierarchy. So there may be a little bit of a hierarchy, particularly for older elementary school children. But kids who might have been performing very well in elementary school may find that they don't perform quite as well in middle school. And so they may drop in that kind of educational status. Children, however, who may have done worse in elementary school may actually bump up in the elementary status, in the educational status. So that in of itself can also be an adjustment for middle school kids. Having said that, the majority of kids tend to make that transition from elementary school to middle school relatively well. Where kids have even more of an adjustment is when they, move into high school. High school really is a major transition for the vast majority of kids, partly because the environment changes. It's one more shift. They may be bused to a high school that's substantially further away from their home than, let's say, the elementary or the middle school. Also, of course, we've already studied this and we looked at this pretty extensively. We see kids, obviously children are now moving into puberty, so there are a lot of developmental changes as well. Interestingly, though, having said all that, we are noticing a trend in grades for high school aged kids in the last few decades. And grades awarded to high school kids have shifted upwards, which is kind of an interesting phenomenon, because when you look at the SAT scores, these have not risen at all. So this suggests that there's some grade inflation going on in high school settings that is partly responsible for this trend. Now, when we look at cross-cultural comparisons from high school kids in the U.S. compared to relatively similar countries across the world, we find that, in fact, high school kids are doing poorer compared to their peers cross-culturally. Kids overall are showing lower scores on testing, and kids overall are showing lower high school graduation rates. And there's a lot of speculation as to why we see some grade inflation, why we're seeing poor testing scores, or that the testing scores are going down. Some of that may be due to recent changes in the last 15 years, 10 years, maybe 15 years now, with the No Child Left Behind programs that have emphasized testing more consistently, more regularly across time. So we may be seeing these trends more overtly because there's more testing going on. More kids are doing the tests now than perhaps in the past, so there's a broader range of children and abilities who are being tested now. So maybe in the past, kids who may have not tested because of poor academic performance are now included in the groups who are being tested, and so the numbers are shifting down somewhat. Some of this also might be due to just the testing phenomenon. Maybe the testing is testing things that are different than what kids are actually learning. And so there may be a shift so kids are doing better in their grades, but the tests themselves really don't reflect what the kids are learning. So there's lots of theories and hypotheses as to why we're seeing this kind of phenomenon over the last 15 years. There are also very specific ethnic and racial differences in school achievement measures. Relative to white students, African American and Hispanic students tend to perform lower. They tend to receive lower grades, and they tend to score lower on the standardized tests. On the other hand, Asian American students in general tend to receive higher grades and tend to do better on these standardized tests. Much of these differences can be rooted, in fact, more on issues of poverty and socioeconomic factors. When socioeconomic levels are accounted for, these differences diminish substantially, and in fact actually disappear with some of these, especially with the standardized testing. We really see this kind of flattening out across groups. So there's really, it is argued that this is really what we're seeing more of a socioeconomic status phenomenon versus racial or ethnic differences. Having said that, there can be some differences for immigrant communities, children from immigrant groups, because typically and obviously what children are taught in school is based on the culture in which they are in, the community that they are in. Tests tend to reflect the norms of the mainstream culture in particular, and so sometimes kids, particularly immigrant children who are not exposed to that or have had as much exposure to mainstream culture, may be at a disadvantage when they take these standardized tests. Nearly 1/3 of students drop out of school, out of high school, without graduating. Leaving school, the reasons for leaving school can be very diverse. It can include pregnancies, unwanted pregnancies, or unexpected pregnancies, finances. Kids are needed to go to work or to help, perhaps on a farm. It can be disengagement in general. It can be due to crime or criminal activity. There's lots of different reasons why kids drop out of school. Males tend to drop out of school more than females. This has been a trend for a long time. Hispanics, Latinos, and African American students are more likely to drop out than non-Hispanic whites. Low-income kids, kids from more impoverished backgrounds, are 3 times more likely to drop out than their middle and upper income level peers. So poverty again, and financial problems once again can have a substantial impact on children, not only how well they do in school, but whether they remain in school or not. Now, higher education. We kind of hinted at this a little bit with Head Start. Some of the literature shows that kids who go into Head Start, not only do they graduate from high school more often than children who do not have a Head Start, literally, the involvement in Head Start, but they are more likely to go into college. Attending college in and of itself is a significant accomplishment. For some families, for some communities, going to college is a major, major achievement. Having said that, the majority of students, nonetheless, nowadays, who go to college are from the middle class and are white. So when we look at whites from rural, poor backgrounds, let's say from whites who are from urban or suburban background and are middle class, the vast majority nowadays of white, suburban, upper middle class, and urban upper middle class and middle class kids go to college. That's a different phenomenon than 100 years ago, when the vast majority of people who went to college were men, young men, who came from upper middle class homes and were white. They were 99% of those who went to college 100 years ago. So this is a substantial difference. But when we look at rural poor, or urban poor, I should also include those folks, white students, those who go to college are substantially less than their white middle class and upper middle class peers. This is also true for black kids as well, comparing poor black students compared to their suburban or urban, not only the white middle class students, but African American middle class, from African American middle class families. What we are seeing is that one of the reasons why fewer students from poor backgrounds, from ethnic minority backgrounds are going to college nowadays is because there is a decreasing availability of financial aid. The amount of financial aid that was available to students 30 years ago was substantially different from what is today. It was possible 30 years ago for a student to have half to the majority of their financial aid come from grant programs. That is, they would not have to pay back the money that they borrowed. Nowadays, the vast majority of financial aid that is available to students are in the form of loans. The interest rates are substantially less than what would be paid from a typical loan that an adult might take out for some other reason, but nonetheless, they are taking out loans and needing to pay back those loans. They are, in order to get money, students typically have to work for it, either in work programs through their local colleges or universities, or by working in a gainfully employment. They have some kind of gainful employment, I should say, in order to pay for their financial, for their educational finances. Only about 40% of those who start college finish the degree 4 years later. That is a substantial difference. Now notice that doesn't say that only 40% of the students who start college finish college. It's that only 40% who start it will finish it within the traditional 4-year window. More and more students are going part-time, 3/4 time, and are then taking much longer to finish their degree program. So less than half, not even a majority of students who enter into college will finish college in that traditional 4-year window period. Again, if you looked at this 100 years ago, that was unheard of. Everyone, of course, finished within the 4-year window, and the majority of these young men then went on to further education because they got their degree in order to become, professional, to pursue some kind of professional work. So that typically included advanced training. So that's really, really interesting. Recent data shows that more and more enrollees in colleges courses are older and non-traditional students, what we would call now non-traditional students. I don't know when we're going to drop that non-traditional student label, since this phenomenon has been going on now very strongly for the last 30 years. 25 to 30% of college students now are between the ages of 25 and 35. Unheard of even 50 years ago, when the average age, when everyone was virtually 18 to 22 years old when they were pursuing their undergraduate degree. 36% of community college students are over the age of 30. As a college degree is required for an increasing number of jobs, many employers are encouraging or requiring further education. And they're willing sometimes to pay for at least part of this education. As young adults age, they reduce their risk-taking behaviors, and they are more likely to focus on their education. So we may see an 18-year-old enroll, and then we may see a 26-year-old enroll. And we're more likely to see the 26-year-old finish the program and do much better with the program as far as academically is concerned than the 18-year-old. As young adults age, they also show what they call a maturation reform, which is kind of an interesting thing. This is kind of interesting. You even see this with the more traditional student between the years 18 to 22-year-olds. Okay, maturation reform is that kids or young students, younger students, I should say, who start school tend to kind of mess up the first or second year, and then by their senior and or junior and senior years, they do substantially better. This is what they call maturation reform. This also occurs across the life cycle. So you look at somebody who's 18, like I said, 26, 36, 46, and you see a substantial difference in how they approach their education, how well they do academically. So somebody can do substantially differently, can do substantially better when they go to school in their 30s than when they went to school when they were 19 or 20 years old. So this is what they mean by maturation reform. And there's lots of different reasons why, again, students delay going to school or going to school later. A lot of it is financial. Some of it is work-related. Workers realize that in order for them to advance further in their careers, they need to go back to school and get further education. Unemployment, they are laid off. They want to change their career, so they go back to school. So there's lots of different reasons why people delay going to school or re-enter school later in life. Now, gender in the classroom. This is definitely can be an issue. Sexism and discrimination still occurs in the classroom. Although perhaps some of this may be more subtle than in years past, where sometimes, 100 years ago, colleges refused to allow young women to enter into their, did not allow young women to enroll in their programs. Or sometimes when young women enter into programs that have been typically dominated by males, they may find that they are ostracized, they may find that they are treated differently, etc. And so we can see this. Young women still report facing some discrimination and sexism in the classroom. There's a very obvious gender gap this is very overt amongst college instructors. So even in the College of Social Work, for example, when we think about social workers, the vast majority of people who are social workers are women. But when we look at college instructors, about 50% of the instructors are men. So that's an interesting kind of phenomenon that we see. Gender distribution in classrooms and across subject areas varies widely. Again, going back, certain academic areas tend to be dominated by young men, or by young women. And so we see this kind of sex segregation. There are some areas that have shifted over the last few years. So, for example, psychology, sociology tended to be heavily dominated by men 30, 40, 50 years ago. If a young woman went for a degree in psychology or sociology, she would probably have been one of the few women that was in the class. Now those degree programs are about 50-50, and with psychology, particularly with clinical psychology, where school psychologists, the particular professional degrees, we're seeing that the majority of students are women. Men are more likely than women to describe themselves as above average in their overall academic and mathematical abilities. They tend to be more competitive, and they tend to report having higher levels of emotional health than women. And the reason why I mention this is that this can impact how somebody does in their educational program. If somebody assumes that they're going to do well, that they are above average, and that they are more emotionally stable, they view themselves that way, they will tend to assume that they will do better and take more risks in the academic world. So women, as a group in general, tend to view themselves less academically, academically average, less competitive. These two in particular may tend to mean that women as a group may tend to take fewer risks, academic risks, with their education. Educators do treat male and female students differently. There's no question about that. With males, they may tend to expect higher academic achievements than for females. With male students, they may tend to be more strict, more demanding. For female students, they may tend to be less strict and less demanding. So we see this kind of difference across gender when it comes to how professors treat their students. Some argue for same-sex learning environments to combat some of these negative effects of gender. So some argue, for example, a female-only environment is advantageous to women, so that they are in an environment where they can explore more some of these other aspects of themselves. The education system is geared more towards how women learn, how women experience life, etc. Others disagree with with those ideas. Okay, as we said earlier in the semester, there is a phenomenon of women, particularly going back to school later in life, in midlife or older adulthood. We also see this with men as well, but we are more likely to see this, at least in the last few decades. We've been more likely to see women doing this than men, although more older men, middle-aged men and older men are returning to the learning environment. Many institutions encourage particularly older adults to do later life learning. We see the phenomenon of elder hostels. There are youth hostels, but now there are elder hostels. This is particularly true in Europe. And many of these elder hostels include educational programs specifically for people older in life. A lot of community education programs are geared towards older adults and to retirees. Most older adults who go into college report having few to no trouble in dealing with the rigors of college classes. They tend to perform as well, if not better, than their younger colleagues, student colleagues. So really, we see that this is a very a valuable experience for everyone who's involved, including instructors, by the way. Instructors value having older persons varied and substantial life experiences. Younger students value having older students in the class as well. So it tends to be a very positive experience for everyone who's involved. Now, another interesting aspect of life, I would say, is the leisure activities. And you'll notice that we're starting with adolescence. Why are we starting with adolescence? We start with adolescence in this particular area of leisure activity because when we're looking at middle school kids or older kids or preschool kids, a lot of their leisure time is spent with their peers or with their families. So what the family does, the kids tend to do. It's not until we hit adolescence that we start to see people starting to kind of forge out on their own into different kinds of leisure activities that are unique and specific to that particular adolescent, and that can be different from that of the family of origin, or even of that of the community that the child is from, or the adolescent is from. What we find that how adolescents use their free time. Let me put it this way. The research is very curious and interesting about studying leisure time activities for adolescents. Really, what we find is that there are significant racial and cultural differences as to how individuals use their free time, their leisure time. Much of the research, unfortunately, has focused primarily on suburban middle-class white adolescents. And so there's kind of a skew in the data because of this. there is an effort now to look at kids from other ethnic and socioeconomic status groups. And like I said, there are some differences across culture because of that. When we do look at suburban middle-class white adolescents, 50% of their time is spent on leisure time activities. That's a lot of time if you think about it. If you think about how much time adults spend in their work environment and or raising children or taking care of other people, let's say, especially if you look at middle-aged adults, and you compare that to, in this case, a white middle-class adolescent, most adults report that they don't spend 50% of their time in leisure time activities. And also that's also true for younger kids. A lot of their time is spent either resting or going to school. So adolescents, particularly for white middle-class suburban adolescents, at least what they report, they spend a lot of time doing leisure time activities. Poor African American adolescents living in rural urban environments spend substantially less time, leisure time, report substantially less leisure time activities. If they do report a leisure time activity, it's usually watching television. And this is also true for other. This has been done with urban African American, poor, I should say, urban African American samples, but this is also true for other poor samples as well. Other patterns in time use. More than half of adolescents spend significant amounts of time on homework and extracurricular activities. So it's kind of interesting, how do adolescents report leisure time activities? Some of them include extracurricular activities as their leisure time activities. So this can be sports, this can be clubs, etc. Around 1/3 spend their time on paid employment. Okay, so a lot of kids are actually working. And as teenagers get older, more and more of them enter the work world. Some adolescents report that the majority of their time, leisure time, is spent with friends and with their peers. So you do, especially over time, what I mean by that is within that vast group of adolescents, as we look at adolescents getting older, you start seeing this kind of bifurcating. Those who kind of are doing leisure time activities with their friends, and those who are focusing more on academics and on work. Okay, so we start seeing this kind of differences across adolescence. Contrary to popular myth, teens are not good at multitasking. Okay. Now, some of that multitasking ability improves with young adulthood, but teenagers are not good at that. Okay. So we see this, that neural structures limit how much divided attention can lend to multiple tasks. This includes adolescence. Okay, so working, doing homework with the music playing on in the background, texting while driving, doing homework while chit-chatting with friends. These typically are not good mixes, including for adolescents. A comprehensive study of children aged 8 to 18 reveals that this age group spends between 6 to 7 hours a day with some kind of media tools. Okay, so this could be watching TV, this can be texting, this can be online, etc. About 25% of this time is spent using multiple devices at once, texting, using the internet, and watching TV all at the same time. So this actually boosts the actual amount of time that teens are on using some kind of media, up to about 8 to 9 hours per day. And some actually believe that these are still nonetheless are underestimates. So probably as technology continues to advance, there are more options available for people to use different forms of technology and to interact with that. These numbers will actually go up. Television viewing, we've already talked a little bit about this, remains the most frequent leisure activity of adolescents, believe it or not. That's across the, although I said that for, for poorer adolescents, they tended to use TV more often as a leisure time activity. Nonetheless, across the map of adolescents, television watching still tends to be the activity that they use the most. Older adolescents whose responsibilities are more time-consuming, preparation for college, they tend to work more often. Schoolwork tends to become more intense for older adolescents. They tend to report less television watching than their younger peers. 2/3 of adolescents report having their own television in their bedrooms. This media outlet conveys messages and influences thoughts about body image, physical well-being, relationships. There's strong evidence to show that adolescents' opinions about these topics are influenced by how much they watch television. Now, whether that influences behavior is a whole other vein of research, shall we say. But at least for the opinions that adolescents report, those who watch more television tend to mimic the opinions that they see on television more often. Obesity has also been linked in research to high rates of TV viewing. So the more likely a person watches, an adolescent watches television, the more likely they report being overweight or obese. Computers and the internet, we still don't know a lot about the effects of the internet. We've already talked about cyberbullying as a major new form of bullying, really, amongst teenagers. Most teenagers, when they are reporting their use of the internet, they tend to report doing entertainment, sports-related activities, watching television. There's a strong phenomenon amongst not only teenagers but young adults, where they are not watching as much real-time television as much as watching television on the internet. So it's delayed broadcast. Maybe they missed a program, so they go online to the program website and they watch the program, off time, or they're watching programs that are specific to the internet itself. We do notice that poor adolescents have less access to computers. There is what they call the digital divide. So this is very evident when we compare kids from suburban middle-class families from either urban or rural poor communities, that there's a clear digital divide. That is, poor teens tend to have less access and tend to use the internet, the computers and the internet less often. Now, of course, I said earlier that I compared teens to middle-aged adults, and middle-aged adults don't have as much leisure time as at least a certain group of middle-class white suburban teens, based on research. But nonetheless, middle-aged adults do pursue leisure time activities. Now, I should say I kind of leapfrogged over young adulthood. We notice that leisure time activities and the amount of leisure time continues to be relatively high, especially for the younger range of young adults. It's still less than younger teenagers, but nonetheless, it's still relatively high. As young adults enter into full-time work, long-term relationships, raising children, having more friends from work, colleagues, etc., the shift in leisure time activity gradually occurs. There's less time for leisure time activity. Nonetheless, they do continue with some form of leisure time activity. Most interestingly enough, even though I said that middle-aged adults don't have as much leisure time activity as, let's say, young teenagers, they still report on average about 70 hours a week of leisure time activity. That's a lot. And in fact, generationally speaking, adults in general, both young adults and middle-aged adults, have substantially more leisure time than their peers from 100 years ago. If you go back 200 years ago to when most people lived on farms and the agrarian lifestyle was the majority for most adults and children, the opportunity for leisure time activities were substantially less. That's because many were, because the farming life can be, an agrarian lifestyle can be very demanding as far as time is concerned, and also there were far more poor people, and when they farmed, they did subsistence farming and subsistence living. That is, much of their time was spent taking care of their basic needs. They had no one to grow their own food, they grew their own food. They had no one to buy clothes for, so they grew the materials so they could then make their own clothes. That is very labor and time intensive, which does not allow for a lot of leisure time activity. Now we see in modern day life that leisure time activities are, the amount of time for leisure time activities is substantially greater. The average middle-aged person watches about 15 hours of TV per week. Adults spend about 6 hours a week socializing. Some turn to charity and community organizations to kind of give of themselves. Life is much faster paced in the U.S. than compared to other countries, with probably the exception of Japan and certain Western European cultures and countries, I should say. And as I said earlier in the semester, some middle-aged adults choose to take an early retirement, and they take on a new job and a new activity. I might also say that when we think about the world of work, maybe I already mentioned this earlier in the semester, but with the growing age of how long people live, people often have now, and I shouldn't say often, but at least a solid proportion of young and middle-aged adults actually have two careers in their lives. They do one career, they go back to school, thinking about, like we just talked about, going back to school, create a new career, and then the second half of their life they have another career. This also happens with leisure time activities. Some of the things that were enjoyable for middle-aged adults when they were younger adults are no longer that enjoyable anymore, and so they choose to kind of forge out and try something new in midlife. Most middle-aged adults report that the pace of their lives does not seem slower. And as they fill up their days with more activities, although they report feeling an enjoyment about having more activities and learning more things, they also report sometimes feeling overwhelmed with a lot of activities or a lot of things that require their time. Free time for middle-aged adults typically comes in fits and starts. So they have 50 minutes here, 30 minutes there throughout the week, not in long blocks of time. This is also true for older young adults. Once people have established a family life, a career life, they find that their free time is broken up into these small intervals as opposed to large blocks of time. The pace of life is faster than in many other countries. Measures of life's tempo documents the quicker pacing of U.S. lifestyles in research. And in fact, you can even look at differences across different geographical locations. So the pace in a rural environment can be substantially slower than that in a large urban environment. the pace, let's say, in one geographical location of America can be different from another geographical location in America. So America is really, geographically, can be very different as far as the pace of life, as far as work opportunities, educational opportunities, even economics. One part of the country can be doing well economically while another part lags behind or struggles. The other thing that we find with America is that over especially the last 30 to 40 years, America has increasingly become more diverse just in general, not only geographically, economically, but when we talk about race, culture, immigrant groups, etc. So 100 years ago, the vast majority of immigrants came from Western Europe. Now, many of our immigrants groups come from Latin America, come from Africa, come from Asia, and come from Eastern Europe, as opposed to Western Europe. So we see this real difference as to what immigrant groups, what communities are developing in the United States. And so we find that our culture in the United States has become substantially more multicultural. And because of this, more and more schools, as well as universities, have been paying much more attention, increasing attention to this diversity and multiculturalism. Cultural background can determine who and how people view themselves, how other people view them, we've kind of already talked about this, and how others treat that individual. U.S. culture has many different levels. I think personally that is unique to the United States. There are other countries across the world that have large and rapid immigration patterns besides the United States, but the United States is unique in the sense that it is, for the most part, a country of immigrants. There were groups of people and different nations that lived here well before any immigrants ever came to the United States, but the vast majority of people who live in the United States today can trace back their roots to some group of immigrants. Of course, we all belong to human culture and we share specific customs as a country, but we, as I've said, we have become more diverse in the groups. And this is, just to kind of interrupt myself, if you go back 150 years ago, this process was already well underway. It's just that the numbers of people that are coming to the United States from diverse different backgrounds and the amount and the rapidity of that change has increased over time, and that's because of technology, globalization, the integration of different cultures, social movements, economics, financial markets have become substantially more integrated than they have ever done before, and we're seeing that now that the U.S. economy is substantially more dependent on the economies of Mexico, Canada, the European markets, the Chinese markets, the Japanese markets, etc. So the rapidity, the intensity, the amount has changed for the U.S. over time. Now, there's always been a different kind of opinions about how should immigrant groups acculturate. And what we mean by that is when groups of people come into a sustained, into first contact with another group, a smaller group immigrates to a larger community, let's say. A smaller group of immigrants comes to the United States, let's say. How do they adjust to that new environment? And how does that new environment adjust to this new group? And there are different opinions about how that should be. Initially, the idea was that of the melting pot. This goes back to about 100 years ago, maybe a little bit longer than that. The idea that all people come together, they merge their different cultural norms, ideas, values, etc., and it becomes one big melting pot of what we call the U.S. culture. The problem with this notion is that many of the immigrant groups, and some groups, such as Native Americans, or one group in particular that was forced to come here against their will, and that is primarily African Americans, found that this melting pot really meant that the mainstream culture was really the main culture, and everyone else's culture had to kind of integrate into that. So that there was still this kind of mainstream culture that absorbed some elements of these other immigrant groups, other cultures, if you will, Black America, American Indian groups. They kind of absorbed some of pieces of that, but still in all, there was this kind of major, typically Anglo-Saxon, Protestant mainstream culture. I'm talking again about 100 years ago. And so people began to resist this idea of the melting pot. Let me get into this a little bit more. There are 4 different kinds of outcomes that typically occur, that can occur, I should say, for different groups that come to the United States. There's integration, which is the process through which people maintain their own culture while simultaneously seeking to adapt and incorporate the majority culture. Those who employ integration often have what is called a bicultural identity, by which they see themselves as part of 2 different cultures. And so typically immigrant groups or African American community or Native communities have talked about this kind of bicultural approach or integration approach when dealing with the mainstream culture. There's then assimilation, which is what this is kind of the melting pot view. This occurs when a person begins to identify with the mainstream culture and rejects the minority culture. There also could be a pressure from the majority culture to assimilate as opposed to integrate. There's also the notion of separation. Some Native communities have taken this approach. Some immigrant communities, a small proportion of the Black community, has also taken this approach, where people identify with an ethnic minority culture to which they belong to, while rejecting or rebuffing the majority culture. This can boost group identity as members separate, both psychologically and even geographically or physically, from the dominant culture. We sometimes see this with some religious communities. For a time we saw this with certain feminist communities during the 70s and 80s, kind of a separatist movement. So sometimes this works, sometimes this doesn't work for a community. There's also marginalization. Marginalization occurs when people identify neither with their minority culture nor with the majority culture. And marginalized individuals lack a clear cultural identity and usually feel alienated from society in general. This tends to occur when there's a breakdown of a subculture or an ethnic community's culture's identity. And so some of the members of this community can feel marginalized, kind of adrift, when you see this breakdown. Some of this has happened somewhat, let's say, with some of the ethnic, what were one time called the ethnic white communities. These were latter communities, white communities that came principally in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Some of these communities have kind of broken down, have kind of disappeared, assimilated, or become marginalized by mainstream culture. Some of this has happened, unfortunately, and tragically, for certain Native communities that were forced, particularly during the 1800s and early 1900s, to abandon their unique identity and community and culture. And so some people have talked about marginalization from this community. Really, the identification of coming from a particular community or group has implications for an individual's sense of well-being. We've really talked about this a lot, but I think the difference here is instead of just looking at the individual's experience, that's still important, I really want to emphasize these kind of cultural norms, cultural ideas that influence whether groups maintain their identity, whether communities are destroyed by the mainstream culture in some way, whether certain communities eventually assimilate and dissipate into the mainstream culture. There are many different factors, cultural, historical factors, that can influence this kind of integration, assimilation, separation, and marginalization. This gets into the whole notion of ethnic identity. Now, ethnic identity refers to how members of an ethnic, cultural, or racial group, typically minority groups, view themselves, both as members of their own group and in relationship to other groups. Okay? And especially with that of the majority culture. Ethnic identity relates to the part of a person's self-concept that is derived from their awareness and knowledge. They are a member of a distinct social, ethnic, cultural group. According to the psychologist Jean Thimme and her and their research, ethnic identity develops in several stages. There's kind of the unexamined ethnic identity. This is the kind of the first stage, characterized by a lack of consideration or exploration of one's ethnicity. It's kind of a given, shall we say. Some people never really look at their ethnic identity. This may be because it's very much assimilated or very much a part of the majority culture. People may look at their ethnic identity more if they immigrate to another community or country, and suddenly their group is a minority group, and so they become much more acutely aware of their ethnic identity and history and background. There is, however, ethnic identity search. Typically, this is when people actively try to understand their heritage, their background, the significant factors of their lives that come from their ethnic background, community, and heritage. And then there's a specific ethnic identity declaration, if you will, in which people fully embrace their ethnic identity. Typically, people who reach this stage while living in a majority culture may become what we talked about earlier, bicultural. Really, most people who explore their ethnic identity really come to a place of what we would call ethnic pride, their membership their membership in a particular culture or community, especially I'm talking about an ethnic minority or cultural minority community, when faced with possible prejudice, marginalization, etc., from the majority culture. When they go through this process of ethnic identity development, they often come to a place of ethnic pride, a sense of belonging, a sense of seeing the positive aspects of their community, and claiming that for themselves, if you will. Of course, this process does not necessarily have a timetable, by the way. We've already talked about the fact that adolescents who come from ethnic and cultural minority communities, racial minority communities, often are faced with these additional kind of questions and concerns about their self-identity. But this can occur in young adulthood, this can occur in middle adulthood. Again, somebody may not be really aware of their ethnic identity until they migrate or immigrate to another culture. Let's say they're from one part of the world and they come to the U.S., and suddenly they're kind of faced with this kind of ethnic identity issue. Again, ethnic identity tends to be strongest for minority group members, and it tends to be weakest for majority group members. And they're probably, that if you think about it, that makes sense, because if you're part of the majority culture, you're probably not going to be really faced with these questions or issues. And so, although there may be some specific ethnic pride for that particular individual, it's not as critical an issue for the individual on a day-to-day basis. We've also talked about socioeconomic status and poverty and its impact on the lifespan development process. It really bears repeating that members of minority groups are disproportionately more likely to live in poverty than non-minority group members. Now, that doesn't mean that the majority of people who are poor in the United States are from an ethnic minority community. That's not true. The vast majority of people who are poor in the United States are white, are Caucasian. But the percentage of people who are poor, who are white, as compared to other whites, is substantially lower than the percentage of people who are, let's say, black, or the percentage of poor amongst Latinos. We have talked that, at least for some Asian American groups and Asian immigrant groups, the poverty level can actually be lower. For the proportion of those who are poor can be lower than for whites. This is partly because for some Asian immigrant groups, those who come to the United States tend to come from middle class or upper middle class backgrounds from their home countries. So they're already their backgrounds are not poor. They may come here for education. They may come here for job opportunities, and so they move from a middle class lifestyle to another middle class lifestyle in the United States. However, if we look at other different ethnic communities, Vietnamese communities, Filipino community, Samoan, etc., Pacific Islander backgrounds, we see that the levels of poverty can be higher and can be disproportionately higher compared to other Asian groups and compared to the white majority. We've already talked about how poverty can affect children and adolescents in a number of ways. Probably one of the most important aspects to think about it from a national level is that we here in the U.S. have the highest rate of poverty than the vast majority of other industrialized nations in the world. What helps poverty? Basically, welfare, social support systems, Medicaid, a better and more efficient government programs. All of these lead to lower rates of impoverishment. Improvements to income levels lead to substantial benefits for everyone in the family, for everyone in that community, for children and adolescents in particular. When we talk about ethnicity, race, and poverty, we also have to look at the issues of prejudice and discrimination. Now again, throughout the semester, we've kind of hinted at these issues, but at a cultural societal level, there are clear advantages and disadvantages that people have based on how they are perceived by others, based on cultural norms of stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination, based on socioeconomic status, based on gender presentation, how whether they're gender conforming or not, as we talked about earlier in the semester, based on ethnicity, based on race. All of these can impact a person's day-to-day life. Okay? Prejudice refers to any negative or positive evaluation or judgment of a person based on their membership in a group. That group's membership is not necessarily a particular characteristic. Let me start that all over again. Sorry. Prejudice is a negative or positive evaluation of a member from a particular group that is placed upon that individual, not because of the individual, what that particular individual does or says or what have you, but based on their perceived membership as part of a specific group. So sometimes, for example, discrimination or prejudice can be very negative. There are negative attitudes toward Latinos, let's say, towards blacks, towards recent immigrants, shall we say, versus those who have been here for a while. And some of those prejudices can be negative, as I said, or positive. Sometimes certain Asian groups are faced with what you would call this kind of positive stereotype about them, which can also be condescending, quite frankly. Prejudice typically are not reality-based, shall we say. They're based purely on group membership. Stereotypes are basically attitudes that people have about groups that may have some basis in truth, but are exaggerated aspects of a group that move into the range of being typically very negative or very idealistic or romanticized. Ultimately, prejudice and stereotypes leads to some form of discrimination. And discrimination is basically any negative action taken toward members of a particular group because of their membership in that group. Discrimination can be overt or it can be covert. It can be individual from one person to the next. It can be institutional. A particular organization behaves in a particular way or functions in a particular way that provides advantages to one group because of the way it functions against the advantages of other groups or to the disadvantage of other groups. Okay? Sometimes biases can be self-fulfilling prophecies. Sometimes people may actually internalize some of these prejudices against their own group. They may feel antagonistic towards their own group. They may try to distance themselves from that other group. So we often see this kind of behavior culturally across groups, etc. There are different theories to why prejudice and discrimination exists. One of this is the idea of social learning theory, which we've already talked about, that basically people learn about stereotypes, learn about how to treat other people based on observing how other people have treated certain members of certain groups, etc. And also the way they are treated themselves because they are perceived to be members of certain groups. There's also social identity theory, which deals with in-group and out-group. This is the idea that every in-group has a sense of protectiveness, a sense of familiarity, a sense of safety with the members of that group. When they encounter another person who's outside of the group or who is from an out-group, shall we say, there may be some reluctance to trust. There may be suspiciousness. There may be stereotypes that the in-group forms about an out-group member from another group, shall we say. And so you find this kind of in-group, out-group mentality. Oftentimes with in-group thinking, there's a tendency to emphasize the positive aspects of the groups while minimizing the negative aspects of the groups, and then emphasizing the negative aspects of the outgroup while minimizing the positive aspects of the outgroup. We see this kind of in-group, out-group behavior with adolescents, by the way, with the kind of cliques that we talked about earlier in the semester. So people who are in-group will tend to view themselves more positively than each person views themselves more positively because they're a member of the group, and they tend to view their group as more positively to that of a group to an outgroup, shall we say. Typically, prejudice, racism, etc., is a function of multiple forces, probably based on in-group, out-group dynamics, based on social learning theory, based on historical factors, and as is typical with this entire semester, when we talk about human behavior, when we talk about human development, there are multiple factors that are involved as to why prejudice, racism, discrimination exists. That's it for this week. I want to remind people to please go look at racial and ethnic identity online. There is a video there and there's some readings there. Please do that. And thank you for your attention.